In the sweltering summer of 1957, amidst the political turbulence of Havana and the simmering tensions between Cuba and the United States, President Dwight D. Eisenhower paced the Oval Office, a map of the Caribbean spread across his desk. Reports of unrest in Cuba had been escalating, with whispers of corruption and tyranny swirling around Fulgencio Batista, the Cuban leader propped up by American interests. Eisenhower's brow furrowed as he studied the latest intelligence reports. His trusted advisor, Robert Cutler, entered quietly, breaking the heavy silence that hung in the air. "Mr. President, the situation in Havana is deteriorating. Batista's grip on power is weakening, and the rebels are gaining momentum." Eisenhower sighed, his mind racing with geopolitical calculations. He had backed Batista as a bulwark against communism in the region, but now the costs were adding up. Reports of Batista's lavish lifestyle stood in stark contrast to the poverty of the Cuban people, fueling discontent and rebellion. The American public and Congress were growing increasingly uncomfortable with their support of the dictator. "Robert, what do we know of Batista's true intentions? Is he an ally we can rely on, or is he leading us down a path of folly?" Eisenhower asked, his voice laced with frustration and doubt. Cutler hesitated before answering, choosing his words carefully. "Sir, there are rumors, accusations of corruption, human rights abuses. The reports from the State Department are concerning." Eisenhower nodded grimly, his jaw tightening. He had gambled on Batista, hoping for stability in Cuba and a staunch anti-communist ally. Now, as the tide turned against Batista, thanks to the propaganda radio of Fidel and Che from the mountains, which was a very powerful weapon in their hands due to the poverty that existed in Cuba, and Fidel's promises to give the wealth to the people with the charisma and ease of words that Fidel and Che had, they were convincing 70% of the Cuban people. Meanwhile, Eisenhower faced a critical decision: continue his support and risk tarnishing the reputation of the United States, or recalibrate his approach and navigate the uncertain waters ahead. Meanwhile, in the opulent halls of the presidential palace in Havana, Fulgencio Batista sat back in his chair, his thoughts consumed by the latest dispatches from Washington. He knew the Americans were growing impatient, but he believed in the righteousness of his cause. Cuba needed a firm hand, a leader who could protect the island from the red tide sweeping across Latin America. As the sun dipped below the horizon in Havana, casting long shadows across its cobblestone streets, both men grappled with their ambitions, their fears, and the weight of their decisions. Little did they know that their fates were intertwined, bound together by the complex dance of power, ideology, and history. "Mr. President, the latest reports from our agents in Havana confirm that the unrest is spreading," reported General Sherman Adams, Eisenhower's chief of staff, solemnly. Eisenhower nodded, his expression grave. "And Batista? He's holding on, but barely. The rebels are gaining ground. The situation is untenable," replied Adams, his voice laced with concern. Eisenhower sighed heavily, his mind replaying decisions made years ago. The United States had supported Batista as a counterweight to communism in the Caribbean, but now the consequences of that alliance were being felt. "Mr. President, the truth about the arms sales." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "There is evidence to suggest that our weapons were used against the Cuban people. The public and Congress are demanding answers." Eisenhower's jaw tightened. He had believed in the righteousness of his cause, but now he was facing the harsh reality of unintended consequences. The decision to sell arms to Batista, once seen as a necessary evil, now haunted him. In Havana, Fulgencio Batista paced the halls of the presidential palace, his once firm grip on power slipping away. The rebels, led by a young, charismatic lawyer named Fidel Castro, had gained momentum, fueled by popular discontent and grievances against Batista's regime. Batista glanced at the framed photograph on his desk, a reminder of happier times with American dignitaries who had once hailed him as the savior of Cuba. Now, facing imminent defeat, he sought refuge. He appealed to Washington for asylum, hoping that the United States would honor their alliance and grant him safe haven. Back in the Oval Office, Eisenhower stared at the photograph of Batista that once adorned his desk. He knew that granting asylum was politically impossible. The public outcry would be deafening, and Congress would never approve. Reluctantly, he turned away, knowing that Batista's fate was sealed. As dawn broke over Havana, Castro's forces closed in on the presidential palace. Realizing that escape was futile, Batista gathered his loyalists and fled into the night, leaving behind a country torn apart by revolution and American intervention. But here's the betrayal, because where there is betrayal, there are lies, which is the only thing we Cubans, victims of good and evil, have heard. This is the reality. In reality, it was Colonel Fulgencio Batista who led a period of economic and social development, in which Cuba emerged as one of the most modern, prosperous, and visited nations in the region. It was also a period of intrigue, corruption, and mafias, in a country that never managed to fully gain independence from the Americans. Those who betrayed the Cuban people after receiving payment for weapons that they should have sent to Batista, and instead handed over to Fidel's rebels. Yes, as you hear it, after Fidel was interviewed by a couple of stupid and very short-sighted journalists who were convinced by the charismatic and very popular supposed defender of the poor, the lawyer Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz. They wrote some articles defending Fidel, who supposedly was not a communist. He just wanted to end poverty and the mistreatment of the people. And there was so much propaganda that they made for him that President Eisenhower decided to help them by handing over these weapons that Batista had already paid for, ordering him to leave the country, which Batista refused at the time. After that, Eisenhower continued to help Fidel, with whom he communicated through journalists or codes in Fidel's speeches, to whom we must thank for the triumph of the revolution imposed by Fidel Castro for 65 years. If it seems like fixation, it is surpassed by reality. There was poverty in Cuba with Batista, it's true, but it was a prosperous country receiving an impressive number of tourists. It was also the most advanced, modern, and prosperous Caribbean country until Fidel arrived with the help of the Americans. Even if they deny it, it was like that. After Eisenhower, who apparently was an easy guy to convince, read the writings of these journalists, one of whom stayed for a while living with the rebels in love with the Cuban cause, Eisenhower decided to betray Batista to help the charismatic lawyer Fidel Castro, to soon wake up listening to the magic words of the same charismatic lawyer Fidel Castro saying in a speech that we were now a communist country and that they would have to control the sugar consumed by the people. And still, at that time, it was the largest sugar producer in the world. Then, Mr. Eisenhower, after hearing the truth from the lips of the charismatic Fidel Castro, felt so mocked and indebted for having betrayed the Cuban people that he began to plan the attack on Cuba known as the Bay of Pigs, where exactly the same thing happened as before. The charismatic lawyer Fidel Castro, just like the previous time, convinced the Americans that he had won the war, that the invasion had been a failure, and how the pawns lining up their weapons, giving their chests to the Castro bullets, were Cubans. Well, this time another charismatic and very dear gentleman, even to me, decided to betray his word to send air support that he had already promised. While the Cubans feel the graze of Castro's bullets, searching the horizon for the planes, they were falling dead or prisoners, which was even worse than falling dead. These betrayals, among others that I will tell you about, such as a law in the Cuban Constitution that includes the Platt Amendment, etc. These are the reasons why the Americans decided to give us Cubans the benefit of the Cuban Adjustment Act for 34 years, 1966, 1995, as if the suffering and death of 1,400 Cubans recruited by the CIA by order of Eisenhower and later supported by JFK could erase so much pain that 11 million Cubans still suffer. But obviously there was a reason for such generosity. And yes, we must thank them because they could have not given us asylum, which I don't think has been very favorable for them, otherwise they wouldn't have closed it in 1995. I hope to bring you other stories very soon.